Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us, and welcome to today's webinar titled EU HTA Joint Clinical Assessments, Navigating Potential Challenges Ahead of 2025, featuring our 5 speakers who will discuss several policy aspects regarding the current challenges and implications of the EU Health Technology Assessment Regulation. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's event, Open Health, for making it all possible. And now, without any further delay, I am pleased to hand things over to Rosemary to take it away.
Thank you, Sydney. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live panel. We thank you for taking the time to join us today as we talk about EU HTA joint clinical assessments, navigating potential challenges ahead of 2025. I'm Rosemary. I'm an executive director at Open Health and will be the moderator of this live panel. I'm pleased to let you know that we have a very exciting dynamic mix of experts today who will walk you through the latest developments in the EU HTA regulation and what it means from a policy, industry, and importantly, a methodological perspective. We will deep dive into the implications of the EU HTA regulation and discuss possible scenarios to hedge against the challenges that we all know are lined up. So with that being said, let me invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, beginning with Ansgar. Ansgar, you're on mute. Yeah, you were on mute. We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Ansgar Herborn. I work for Roche's Pharma division based here in Switzerland. Considerable part of my role is dedicated to policy initiatives in the EU, like the EU HTA regulation that we talk about today. I also do chair FPIA's HTA working group with key focus on the introduction and implementation of the EU HTA regulation. I also represent FPIA in the EU HTA stakeholder network, which is an important element of the HTA regulation going forward.
Thank you, Ansgar. James?
Thank you, Rosemary. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm James Ryan. I'm the Global HTA Policy Director at AstraZeneca. Like Ansgar, I've been working very closely on the EU HTA, both internally for AstraZeneca, but also sit in the FPIA HTA working group where I've been a co-lead around methodology on that. And I'm a health economist by background, having made a lot of submissions in oncology around Europe and the rest of the world. And looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, James. Very excited to have you both on board. Nick and Sonia, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. Hi, everyone. My name's Nick Halfpenny. I am a director in the Strategic Market Access Group within Open Health based in Rotterdam. Got around 10 years consultancy experience in the HUR market access space, and within Open Health, I lead the evidence synthesis offerings that we provide within the SMA team. So that covers everything that we do in terms of systematic literature reviews. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia Koop. I'm an associate director in the modeling and meta-analysis team at Open Health. Within Open Health, my role is to lead the indirect treatment comparison service area. So my main experience is in network meta-analysis and indirect treatment comparisons, but also endpoint surrogacy analysis, for example. Looking forward to this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you all for the introductions. So over the next 40 minutes, our panelists will present bite-sized insights, starting with Ansgar, who set the stage for the discussion. James will then zoom into the industry perspective, given his extensive experience. We will then take a deep dive into some of the more technical elements, which Nick and Sonia will share, especially around their ideas and our proposed solutions to tackle the multiple PICOs, which is the elephant in the room. We will then open it up for Q&A. So you're welcome to type your questions in the chat window. We will try to get to all of them, but given the time constraints, we might also need to follow up on a few of them offline after the webinar. But please pop them in and we will periodically be reviewing the questions. Thank you, and over to Ansgar.
Thank you, Rosemarie. During the next couple of minutes, I'd like to provide you with relevant context on the EU HTA regulation, which I think is important to understand to make sense out of what we see now and what we really try to cover during the next hour. We'll hear certainly a lot about common European assessment methods that still have to be identified. Shared data and expertise was one of these clear benefits or ideas here. We share data and expertise on the HTA agency side. And of course, the idea to have common procedures, transparent procedures across the EU. Now, the question is, of course, what is this all for? And I think it's important from time to time to go back to these higher level objectives that were put forward to the HTA regulation when it was proposed by the European Commission. So one element is really this higher goal of a higher level of human health protection across the EU. But then more specifically, certainly of interest to the participants here in this call, there was the ambition, this is out of a infographic of the Commission, the idea to find a way to have and provide faster market access for innovative products. A lot of this, what we talk about here today, is about informing decision-making. And the idea is to take earlier decisions earlier, faster, based on solidified information about innovative medicines and medtech, is one of the key elements and potential drivers for faster market access. There's the idea to create more transparency for patients and producers around assessments and specifically assessment methodologies and procedures. And then there was a major efficiency promise for both sides, for HTA agencies, but also for industry, is to avoid unproductive duplication of work between member states by elevating some of the work to the EU level. We need to keep this in mind. We need to look after this. We need to monitor progress over time to make sure that the heavy work that we do all for this, ultimately for the regulation, will have a meaning and is for some end that's relevant for patients, ultimately. If you go to the next slide, the governance model, briefly on the governance model, it starts with the coordination group, which is in the center. This is a member state initiative, which is supported by the European Commission, which has the secretariat for the whole initiative. The member state coordination group breaks down the work that's expected into 4 key areas and has appointed chairs of subgroups. These subgroups are up and running. There's a subgroup that works on the clinical assessment procedures. There is one that works on joint scientific consultations, so ultimately creating capacity and capability so that companies that are interested in scientific advice in the earlier stage of clinical development can have access to such a resource, to an early scientific advice resource, also in parallel with the regulatory authority EMA here. There is one group that focuses on the identification of emerging health technologies that ultimately guide the work plan of the coordination group. And there is a group that looks into methodological guidance, which I think is certainly also of interest to many of us. How will this aligned European methodology ultimately look like? The stakeholder network is an important forum to engage for the coordination group to engage with stakeholders, with industry, with patients, with clinician experts, in order to have a constant exchange on practices, but also the opportunity to tap into relevant expertise and feedback from stakeholders. A key enabler of this work is the IT platform for this future EU HTA construct, which is currently in development. Going to the next slide. I think it's important to understand really the timelines. Where are we? We are in the implementation phase. There's a 3-year implementation phase, quite advanced in this phase. But then the idea is that from 2025, and exactly I think it's the 12th January 2025, new products in oncology and their subsequent indication, also ATMPs, and selected high-risk medical devices will undergo joint clinical assessment procedures. There's a staggered introduction. So in 2028, January 2028, orphan medicinal products will be appended, put on this agenda of the coordination group. And in 2030, there is the idea that all new medicines and their subsequent indications will go through the JCA process. Looking more specifically into the implementation phase, and I mentioned we are quite advanced now, it's nearly 2/3 of the time of the 3 years that is listed in the regulation as implementation phase is gone. Now, what has happened so far, and this is also what's the basis of us planning ahead, and also most of the ideas, or nearly all of the ideas that you will see here in this webinar. UNETA 21, which is actually and was a service contract of the European Commission, has conducted quite a wide range of preparatory work for the European Commission. It was done for the European Commission to feed into something that's called implementing acts. That's a form of secondary legislation in the EU. And of course, also the other procedural rules and the methodologies that the coordination group during the next 14, 15 months will have to define and release. So at this moment, the most important development here is the work on one of these implementing acts, which sets the procedural rules for the joint clinical assessment of medicines, which will define the involvement of parties and stakeholders, which will define the timelines of a process and a few other elements, which will then be complemented by the coordination group's released guidance and other procedural aspects. Those two together, it's really those two, not just these implementing acts, will have to ultimately guide us in preparing for 2025. We don't know exactly how this will be released. We know that the implementing acts, all of those here, starting from the first one with the focus on the joint clinical assessment, will have a 4-week public consultation phase at the end of that procedure. So we will see this at some point. It's also clear when and how the adopted methods and procedural rules of the coordination group, which complement the implementing acts, will be released and ultimately promoted and more widely shown to the stakeholders, which I think is, of course, critical, important for our preparation. Now, as the chair of an HTA working group of an industry association, I'd like to take a few final remarks on what are our priorities in this engagement. We are part also of the stakeholder network going forward. I think these are our key priorities that we try to promote during the implementation phase. I think we need to make sure that there is sufficient capacity and capabilities and expertise to provide access to joint scientific consultations. It's clearly an important element to have ultimately also high quality submissions and the right evidence at the table of joint clinical assessments. For the joint clinical assessments itself, I think we need to make sure that this process is workable. We work under extreme timeline constraints of the regulation, and we need to make sure that the JCA process starts at the earliest point in time, that there is an efficient use of this limited time that's available. Our key ask here then also is to make sure that we work on the right elements and aspects in our submissions to have a timely, high quality submission, is that there is systematic and meaningful involvement of the manufacturer, health technology developer, patients, clinicians, and others in the JCA process, starting with the planning of the scoping process. I think that's a critical success factor. I think we need to come to something that's workable in terms of the scope of these assessments. And here you will hear more about the PICO consolidation and the PICO process and how to prepare for PICOs that are put forward in the scope. of a JCA. And then, of course, an important element is the methodology, the evidence standards that also can reflect the context and challenges under which innovative medicines are developed. You may recall there is a specific statement in the regulation that requires that methodological choices that are made in the implementation of the HTA regulation have to consider the specifics, for example, of orphan drugs, to ensure that these can be adequately reflected in the JCA process. What I have not spoken about, but which is equally important in 2024, is of course all the question about how to use the outputs at a subsequent stage when national decision-making processes are supposed to use those. So you will see also, next to all the work at EU level, a lot of work in countries, we hope, in member states, to adopt for the outputs and their use in decision-making. Thank you. And I think with this, I hand over to my colleague, James. Bye.
Thank you, Ansgar. And really now we're going to move from that sort of external environment of what does this mean to thinking a little bit more internally. What does that mean for the health technology developer as they're preparing for the EU HTA? And we've got a couple of slides on this. So I'll first start around what does it mean for our end-to-end thinking? And by end-to-end, I mean from very early clinical design all the way through to our national submissions. And we can categorize that in 4 key areas. So the first one's around evidence development. What will EU HTA mean for us in terms of the clinical trial design? What about the PICOs that we'll talk, you'll hear more about over the next few slides with myself and other presenters. But also with those PICOs, where are the evidence gaps? What's the supplementary evidence that we might need? And that might be from the clinical literature, it may be real world evidence, it may be patient experience data. And then finally, when we've got all of that, what does that mean for your systematic literature review scope? When we take into account all the different populations and comparators that may be requested, that has a direct influence on the SLR itself. And so we're trying to think around those potential PICOs very early on in trial design, but also all the way through the procedure up until the submission itself. But evidence development's only one part. We've also got to think around how do we work as an organization. And that can be at different levels. It depends on the structure of the company. But just to give you an example here is EU HTA will touch both local, so they could be the local affiliates or marketing companies. If there's a regional structure in place, it will influence region, and also the global functions as well, where global tends to be generating the key clinical trials there. And we've got to be aware that the EU HTA isn't just relevant for Europe itself, it may also have implications across the rest of the world. So once you look at those different levels of the organization, you've got to think around what are the different functions that need to be involved here. And again, those functions and the titles may differ between different companies, but really we're looking at functions like clinical and clinical operations. How can you implement the changes into the clinical trial? Regulatory, the biometrics or statistics and programming functions. You've got the health economics, the market access, pricing and market access, implications with that. Regulatory is going to be really critical because it's in parallel with the regulatory submission. The label, the final label will also determine that overall HTA strategy that you've got, but will also potentially influence the PICOs. And once you've talked around the different functions that are involved in that, and those functions are also relevant at a local and a regional level, you've got to think about what does that mean for your governance and your processes. So who needs to be involved, what needs to be involved, and when do they need to be involved as well to pull that together, because this is something that is very different to the way that we've operated with HTA up until now. And moving on to the third phase, we've got the actual submission itself and our expectations based on the guidance and the proposals that UNETA have provided, particularly around PICO selection, is that we should be expecting a high volume of analyses, a high number of PICOs. Certainly, their case studies, that were around 10 other case studies and simulations that have done, they've predicted at 15 plus PICOs, certainly for common oncology indications. And so you're going to need to be able to do that, but you're going to have limited turnaround time to be able to do that within the timeframes of the regulation as well. So you'll need to start doing some of those analyses and indirect comparisons at risk before we've got confirmation of the PICOs. You've got to understand what is the capacity to be able to turn around that volume and what are the different capabilities that you're going to need. So this will be a multi sort of capability need, ranging from programming, biometrics. You've got to understand the medical environment. We've got the health economics and HTA methodology, maybe project management and medical writing in there. And then finally, you've got the communication. So how do you write that submission up? But also, how do you communicate with the rest of the organization and eventually your local markets who will be needing to incorporate this within their own national submissions? Which takes on to that fourth piece, which at the moment, and we don't actually know which PICOs will belong to which member states. So that limits that ability to prepare for those member states, because you will also need to be doing complementary analyses and certainly economic models and analyses in those countries that require it. And also we need to think about what does that mean for future readouts. So in oncology, you generally have several readouts as the data matures. So does that mean that we'll be required to update EU JCA itself? If so, at what time? Or does it mean that the countries themselves, the member states, will be asking for specific analyses on that later date to cut off? And then the key bit that we face is that label change implication, which brings us back to why it's important to be working with the regulatory function so we understand what the EMA are thinking throughout this process and make sure that we can preempt any label change and ensure that we've got the evidence available. So we've talked a little bit about the PICOs, and others will be going into a little bit more detail here, but just to highlight how critical they are to the whole joint clinical assessment itself. It's the foundation of the submission, and essentially will outline what are the questions that we need to answer as the health technology developer. And I split this into three parts, which is part of the PICO framework. So the first bit is populations and subpopulations there. So how do you've got to be able to think about what the proposed label is, what that end label might be. What about your clinical trial population? Are there any subpopulations? Some countries may call them subgroups, but subpopulations that are going to be required within that. Because for each population that is defined, you get a specific PICO request. In the middle there, we've talked around the outcomes, which are really important. So what are those clinical endpoints that will be needed? The UNETA guidance promotes the use of the patient-reported outcomes in that, which is good, because that will ensure that member states are proactively looking at PROs rather than just, for example, health state utility. Under those clinical endpoints, I'm also covering final endpoints like overall survival, which is relevant in oncology. And then finally, they've got safety. And my personal view here is things like joint scientific consultation that's part of the regulation is most useful for us in defining what those stratification factors or subpopulations might be, as well as the endpoints that we need to be collecting in that. On the comparator side, which is the other component, is the approach that has been done by UNETA to date is that we will add all of these PICOs together. So where you have a population and member states require different comparators, we add that together. So it's additive rather than harmonized, We should expect that there are many comparators. It will depend on the exact indication. But for example, in first-line lung cancer, we can expect maybe 9 or 10 different comparators to be putting forward there. And therefore, although the methodology from Yanetta sort of suggests that indirect comparisons are an exception, actually they're very much a critical and necessary part of the EU HTA. And the reason that I've not really thought around the comparators influencing clinical trial design, which is a global aspect, is that unless Europe can actually harmonize on what is the most relevant comparator, that actually you end up with multiple comparators. And from an operational perspective, that is not possible within a clinical trial itself. And then throughout all of this, we need to have that ongoing monitoring process to ensure that our evidence generation is as complete as possible to answer the PICOs that have been requested. So I'm going to end on that and pass you over to talk around accommodating multiple PICOs. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, James. So yeah, for this next section, what we would like to focus on really is how it's going to look practically when you have to accommodate these multiple PICOs as part of your JCA. So I want to start just by highlighting again what it is we know in terms of the implications for our evidence generation. Well, we know how the PICOs are going to be formed. It's going to be via a survey that's sent out to the 27 member states, which will be consolidated by the coordination group. What we also know at this point, at least from the information we have, is that it doesn't seem that the health technology developer will be directly involved in that PICO scoping process. In terms of how that will look for PICO, so consolidating 27 inputs into one PICOs is not going to be realistic, so we're going to have multiple PICOs. James has already mentioned on potential numbers that we could have, and it will vary across JCAs, but we will have multiple PICOs. And we will have differences, most likely in terms of the comparators. So there might be some comparators that are relevant in certain markets and not in others, and also some differences, potentially some specifics in the patient populations. So and subpopulations potentially, for example, by treatment line. Some may be relevant in certain markets and not in others. What we also know is that timelines are likely to be a challenging factor here. We have a proposal at the moment from United 21 of 90 days between the publication of the final PICOs and the deadline for the JCA submission. Now, that may change as it's currently in discussion, and we may see a difference when it comes to the implementation acts, but that's the information we have at the moment. And obviously that's going to be an extremely challenging timeline to be able to finalize all of your evidence generation activities. So the key here is really going to be early engagement with your local affiliates, with key internal and external stakeholders. Again, James has touched on how that could potentially look within an organization. The point I just want to emphasize here is that it's really going to be a key step at the start of your evidence generation planning to be able to try and understand how those PICOs will look. So in this next slide, what I'm showing here is a timeline from the start of our evidence generation activities to the point of the JCA submission. And this is a timeline that we will show throughout the slides and we'll build on as we go through, showing how the different components of the SLR and the ITC will fit into this timeline. But what we're recommending is really starting as early as possible. Ideally, you'd be looking at 2 years prior to your JCA to be starting your evidence generation activities. So that will be the point where you initiate the SLR. You will start that early engagement to try and predict what this final PICOs will look like. The type of evidence that you're going to want to look for in your SLR will be highly dependent on the indication. And Sonia will touch a little bit about this later on, for example, when is a good time to consider potentially including observational studies, for example. But the key I want to sort of emphasize around this timeline is that we would recommend ideally starting this 2 years prior with regular scheduled updates to your SLR. A successful model that we've applied in a lot of our projects is to have scheduled 6 monthly updates. And that gives you ample opportunity to update your protocol if it's necessary, if it's become apparent that there are certain comparators that will likely be relevant for some of the PICOs, or if indeed there are subpopulations that have become apparent that will be relevant. With these regular updates, you have several opportunities to update your protocol and also gradually build up that evidence base towards your final submission. What we are also recommending is that within this timeline, you build in an update scheduled for 6 months prior to your submission. The reason being that this will fall within the threshold that's set by many HTAs, stipulating that your evidence base should be no older than 6 months at the time of your submission. And what this also means is that if we've been able to predict accurately what those PICOs will look like, then it may not even be necessary to update the SLR at the time of the final PICOs publication. Obviously, if there are any discrepancies between what you've predicted and what is issued at the final PICOs, then that would be your opportunity to run your final update to the review. And I guess what's also good to note here is that it doesn't stop here. I mean, this is the timeline I'm presenting towards the JCA submission, but obviously you're going to have local HTA submissions after this, so in all likelihood you will need to continue updating your SLR. But for the purposes of today, we will just focus on the JCA. So how will it look in terms of how you design your SLR? Well, there are two approaches really that you can take. You can do a broad single SLR where you essentially consolidate everything that you expect in those multiple PICOs into a single search. Alternatively, you can build individual searches per PICOs, and there are pros and cons to each approach. So with a single SLR, you avoid potential duplication efforts and inefficiencies when it comes to screening. So in all likelihood, there's going to be considerable overlap between these PICOs. If you go a multiple SLR approach where you have individual searches per PICOs, you're going to end up searching for the same comparators in multiple searches. You're going to screen the same articles against multiple PICOs. So there's potentially a lot of duplication efforts there. Also, with a single SLR, it's less time intensive in terms of updating materials. You would have one protocol and one set of searches to update. But one nice advantage, I think, of the multiple SLR approach is that it does allow you the opportunity to have a clean study flow per PICOs. So you can easily see how many abstracts and titles have been identified per PICOs and follow that study flow all the way through your Prisma. With a single SLR, that's not possible because everything is combined in a single search. So really it needs to be at the end of your study flow where you basically bucket the articles into the different PICOs that they meet. So as I said, there's pros and cons to each, but what I want to show over the next couple of slides is really why at Open Health we feel the best approach to one of these submissions is to undertake a broad single SLR. And to do that, I'm going to focus on this last part of the timeline from when your final PICOs is published to when you need to submit. As mentioned, the proposal is 90 days. That may change, but we'll use that for illustrative purposes just now. So what I want to do is present an example scenario and walk you through how we would address that scenario with a single review and with a multiple review. So The scenario we have is 3 PICOs. Now, in all likelihood, it's probably going to be more than that for your JCA, but we'll use 3 PICOs for the example. And there's been a deviation at the point of your final PICOs publication to what we expected. So the first is that comparator X we thought was going to be relevant for PICOs 1, but it's actually relevant for PICOs 2. And the second deviation is that we have an additional subgroup that's relevant for PICOs 3. So with a single SLR, you would need to update one protocol to account for the inclusion of this subgroup. Importantly here, there would be no rerunning of searches that would be needed at this point because we've already searched for comparator X. We just thought it was relevant for PICOs 1, but it's actually relevant for PICOs 2. So the only thing we would need to do there is reclassify the evidence and group it under the appropriate PICOs. On top of that, we would need to rescreen our articles to identify if there was any subgroup data for PICOs 3, all of which would feed into your ITC update and then into your JCA submission. If we take the exact same scenario and we try and address it with a multiple SLR approach, then essentially what we have is to update 3 protocols. We would need to remove comparator X from our PICOs 1 SLR and update our screening decisions. So inclusions for comparator X would now need to be exclusions. We would need to add it to our PICOs 2 SLR, which would mean we would need to run a supplemental search from database inception to the date of the last search, specifically for comparator X, and update our screening and our Prisma. And then on top of that, we still have to do the rescreening for the PICO3 subgroup data. So all of that, again, would need to be done before feeding into your ITC update into your submission. So what you can hopefully see from this example is that just a slight deviation from what we anticipate for the final PICOs can quickly snowball into a lot of additional work, especially with that multiple SLR approach. So that's why we feel that the single broad SLR is the way to go. So I'm going to pass now to Sonia, who's going to walk through a little bit more of the ITC components.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Yeah, so I will tell you something about planning your ITC around the GCA time. So really the quantitative evidence synthesis part of the story. So we start, well, ideally we start the SLR 2 years before the GCA submission. And what we need to do is to have have a really early assessment of the quantitative evidence base. So we need to do that as soon as possible so that we can evaluate the evidence that the SLR identified. So we do actually an ITC feasibility assessment. Ideally, this will be based on randomized controlled trials. However, we want to know at the early stage if there's a lack of those. So maybe we need to add some observational studies or single arm studies. Or maybe those are not available as well, and we need to integrate real world evidence into the indirect treatment comparisons. So once we find in the ITC feasibility assessment that we don't have RCTs, we can immediately discuss with the SLR team, can you maybe update the search strategy? And then they can include additional studies, so observational single arm studies, so that we can extend our evidence pool and base our ITC feasibility assessment upon the updated evidence. And secondly, why we need to start very early. For the SLR, we had a nice solution. We can do one broad SLR for the 3 or multiple PICOs. For the ITC, unfortunately, that's not a solution. So we need to do an ITC and a feasibility assessment for each PICO. So if I continue with the example of Nick, we will have 3 PICOs and we have 3 different evidence bases. However, that's actually not the whole story. So for example, we've done your broad single SLR, and the squares here are all the articles that you find. So what we will do is we will categorize those articles by PICO. So we have here 3 PICOs with different colors. Maybe some comparators will overlap. Maybe PICO3 is a subpopulation, so you only have a small group of articles and some overlapping with the other 2. And still, that's not really the story. So we don't have 3 evidence bases, but we also need to look by outcome. Also, just an example, we have maybe 3 outcomes, and the first one is complete response. So first what we do is evaluate which articles report on complete response. So maybe some are overlapping again, and you see there are 3 different evidence bases for 3 different PICOs. Maybe for progression-free survival, a lot of articles report on that, and you have different evidence bases. Although it overlaps, it's still a different ITC that you need to conduct. And maybe for your third outcome, overall survival, might be immature data, so maybe other studies are reporting on that. So in the end, we have 9 evidence bases instead of 3. So what we usually do during our ITC feasibility assessment, we look at 3 main elements. So I just want to cover what you already need to assess at the early stage for those 9 evidence bases. So usually we look at the evidence source. Do we have randomized controlled trials? Do we have non-randomized studies? Or do we have real-world evidence data or registry data? And then we see, or we check if we have a connected network. Second, we always look at the quality of the included study, so the Cochrane risk of bias assessment. And we do the similarity assessment. So we need to identify the treatment effect modifiers very early. Probably they're similar for all the 9 evidence bases, but it can also be the case that maybe for a certain subpopulation or a certain outcome, the treatment effect modifier will differ. So we need to take that already into account. And then at this stage, you have other considerations. Maybe you need to adjust for baseline risk. You need to look if you have individual patient level data. And then following these 2 first elements, you do the methodological assessment. So ideally, what would be most easy is that for your 9 evidence bases, you have enough RCTs and you can do a Bayesian network meta-analysis. However, more probable is that for some evidence bases, you won't have only RCTs, or you need to adjust for treatment effect modifiers or heterogeneity in that. So maybe you need to do a population-adjusted indirect comparison. Also for that, the unanchored comparisons are currently not recommended in the UNETA guidelines, so you need to think about individual patient level data. How can I get that? If you have real-world evidence, you might need to think about propensity score methods. So there will be a variety of networks, disconnected or connected, and you need to have various appropriate ITC methodologies. Okay, so once you've done your feasibility assessment, you know what methodology you want to use. And what we recommend is that you do all the dry runs before the final PICOs are published. So you need to do 9 dry runs. Why do you need to do this very early? First, you need to run everything to see if the results are very uncertain. Maybe you need to think about sensitivity analysis. Maybe you need to adjust some things. Second, if you have very complex ITCs, such as non-proportional hazards, if there are issues, you need to reprogram, which can cost a lot of time. And then finally, it's very important that you do a very detailed quality control. So all the results from the SLR that goes into the ITC need to be quality checked. We cannot afford for any errors to be found after the final PICOs are published, because then we don't have time to make any adjustments. Okay, so we've done our dry runs and then the final PICOs are published. So although it's still the proposed 90 days, so it's not fixed yet, we need to update the SLR. Maybe there are some tweaks, and we need to update the ITC accordingly. And then we have to develop our submission. So the GCA reports according to the requirements that are now provided in the ITC guidelines as well. So this is a lot of work, and as Open Health, we developed a platform to make it a little bit easier. So because we have a wealth of information, going through 100 pages of SLR results, ITC results will just not be doable. So within this evidence synthesis interactive dashboard, we have all the results together at one platform. So what you can do, you can navigate through the different PICOs and see how the ITC results are by PICO. And this is especially very handy when you need to update PICOs. So say there's a final PICO publication and some evidence from PICO 1 need to go to PICO 2. They can easily select the study, navigate it or reassign it to PICO 2, and then directly see how this evidence will impact the ITC results. Secondly, what is very important is that we need to have time to interpret the results. So we have 3 PICOs, we have 3 outcomes or maybe more. We don't want to spend a lot of time formatting our results, using input tables. So within this framework, we can easily select the input tables, the results from the ITC, the graphs that you want to show, and those will be directly integrated into your GCA report. So we can really focus on the interpretation and developing the GCA submission. Also for this, we will have an example of the interactive dashboards at our booth at ISPOR in Copenhagen. Over to Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. So just to conclude, we have highlighted some aspects that we feel are going to be key to successful submission. So being prepared and starting early, that's something that we've tried to emphasize over these slides, is really going to be key. What you've hopefully also seen through these slides is that there's going to be, from the point that you start your evidence generation to the point that you have your submission, there's going to be a lot of moving parts across that whole process. It's going to be really, really key that there's close collaboration between the health technology developer as well as the SLR and ITC teams. You know, I can speak from my experience in consultancy that I know this doesn't always happen, and sometimes these work streams are done independently of each other, and you end up with an SLR that really doesn't feed the needs of an ITC. So it's going to be really key that you're confident that these teams are set up in a way that they can communicate efficiently across this process. We're also going to need teams that are agile and ready to act quickly. So we can be as prepared as possible, but there's always the chance that when this final PICOS gets published, there's going to be something that we're not expecting. And as you've seen from the examples that we've presented, that can quickly turn into a lot of work with a very short turnaround in terms of delivery. So you're going to have teams that are just ready to jump on that. And then as Sonia has quite nicely shown, there's going to be a ton of information to digest for any of these submissions. You know, we've presented scenarios with 3 PICOs, but in all likelihood, it's going to be more. If you're talking about, you know, multiple outcomes per PICOs, that's a ton of analyses that you're going to have to navigate and interpret. So having a platform that allows you to do that easily, like Sonia has just shown you, is going to be really beneficial for anyone doing these submissions. So with that said, I'd like to pass to Rosemary to close out this part of the session.
Thanks, Nick. And I want to say thank you for all the presentations so far. So as you have probably realized, as exciting as the 2025 outlook is, it's not without its challenges and uncertainties and a lot of open questions, especially around aspects such as analytical complexity and stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement, time frame for the JCA dossier submission, and ultimately the proof of the pudding, right? Like they say, the uptake at the level of the member states. Why I've projected this slide, I just want to take a minute to talk about why we think this is such an important topic, and because it's also critical for the industry to find a strategic partner that can think along with you and offer seamless solutions across your SLRs, ITCs, HTA strategy submissions, and your modeling needs eventually. And also consider a partner that will provide added expertise on payer strategy, payer communications, and RWE and patient engagement. And this seamless integration, as you can see on the slide, is our everyday work at Open Health. So I'd like to invite you to visit our booth at ISPOR The panelists, so Sonia, Nick, and myself, we will be at the booth, of course, for most of the time, but especially on Tuesday around lunch hour, we have a special session to focus on the EU HTA regulation. And if you have any questions, we can pick them up there as well. So let's now move into the Q&A segment. If the panelists could come back online, fantastic. Great, there we are. So I can see that we have a question in the chat for an ATMP which has an orphan designation. That's an interesting one. Will the joint clinical assessment be mandatory in 2025 or 2028? I do have some thoughts on this, but I want to ask the panelists if they'd like to comment to give it a go.
Maybe I can start on that. My interpretation is that if it's an ATMP, it hits in 2025, and you'll have similar with oncology indications that may have an orphan designation. So my interpretation is if it's oncology or ATMP, irrespective of its orphan designation, you'll be subject to JCA in 25, as long as it's the first time it's been submitted to the EMA for marketing authorization. So anything that's submitted before January 25 is excluded.
That's very helpful. Thank you, James. I hope that answered your question, Ugo. Ansgar, could we talk a bit about uptake at the level of the member states? Do you have any thoughts on what would influence this uptake?
Thanks, Rosemary. Yes, so we think the uptake will ultimately depend on a number of factors, and certainly a key factor is certainly stakeholders and their interest to make sure that this regulation will, first of all, not delay something, not delay decision making at national level, and ideally accelerate decision making. So certainly as industry, as one of those stakeholders, but I would assume there's patient groups, there's others as well that have an interest, a vested interest, to make sure that this will be optimally used for accelerated decision making, will drive this discussion that's needed in member states. That's one group. The other group that I think has an interest, at least in many countries, are HTA agencies themselves. I think they are all, in every single country, even the largest, suffer from massive resource constraints. They will not be able to grow. And I think they understood, or a significant number of them understood by now and understand by now, that this is an opportunity to share resources and to benefit from resource sharing at EU level. So that's another driver to clear the way, potential hurdles, legal hurdles, in member states to effectively use the outputs. Time is running. I mentioned it's really 2024. That's when this has to be cleared in countries. European Commission, I think, does very helpful conferences. There's one coming up on the, I think it's 22nd in Seville in Spain, where a number of countries, key stakeholders, policymakers will meet to discuss these implications for the country. The meeting in Germany, some of you may know, was a similar event to think about how to optimally use this, how to prepare, and how to clear the way for using these options.
Very helpful. Thank you, Ansgar. James, you touched upon evidence generation requirements across member states. Specifically, yeah, I think what jumped out was what you mentioned about subpopulations. Could you elaborate a bit more on how you think this can be handled?
Yeah, and I think there's one challenge around what's the definition of subpopulations versus subgroups. And my interpretation to date has been subpopulations maybe around clinical criteria. So that might be the severity of the disease. It might be, are you treatment line, if you've got variable history and treatment lines within the clinical trial, whereas subgroups will be around things like age, sex, etc. On that. I think the key thing here for countries and at a member state level, and what I would like to see is that there's guidance around how you go about selecting subpopulations. There is no guidance at the moment on that, or even comparator selection, and it should really be based on some key evidence-based sort of medicine principles. So and also on clinical rationale and plausibility behind that. So, what are the clinical guidelines saying? What do we know from other medicines around that? And primarily, actually, what's within the clinical trials. So, we want to have robust evidence. Let's look at how we've stratified and any sort of predefined, specified subpopulations within the trial itself. And looking at that will allow, I suppose, member states as well as the technology developers to understand what some of those populations might be. But it should be based on clinical criteria and biological plausibility rather than any other factors when selecting those subpopulations. Just a quick comment on the subgroups. Which actually quite a lot of HTA agencies would define as a subpopulation, but we have some HTA agencies that go into a lot of mandatory subgroups, and you do a lot of analyses on those, and actually the vast majority of those analyses aren't actually used at a decision-making level as well. So one thing we're wanting to ensure is actually subgroups probably aren't that relevant at a EU population level. Let's do that at as complementary analyses if they're really required. And let's really be devoting resources, not just our resources, but the assessors and HTA bodies' resources on analyses where actually decisions can be made, and not on additional analyses, which is there just to create a feeling of certainty that you've covered all the bases.
Wow, that's such an important point. Prioritization is key, especially given the time crunch that we all have to work with. Moving the spotlight onto you, Nick. From examples you've shown, it's clear that the SLR work is going to be exhaustive. What are your thoughts on using AI, the buzzword these days, for SLRs and JCA?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a very pertinent one at the moment. I'm sure anyone that's attending this for next week will see just how much of a hot topic AI is at the moment in HEOR, and specifically in the use of SLR processes. And that's something that we are certainly at Open Health. It's the forefront of our thought leadership activities. We're aiming to publish a couple of things next year and run a few panels on the use of AI within SLRs. In terms of where it fits within the JCA process, I think it certainly can have a place. We've seen a lot of advances over the last few years in terms of the accuracy and efficiency of these tools, but I think we still have a way to go, because the key next step is going to have some clear guidance on the acceptability of using these tools within submissions like these, and we don't have that yet. And personally, I don't see it, at least anytime soon, replacing the human element to an SLR. So there are so many intricacies when screening populations, when finding the data that are relevant for the extraction and against the PICOs. I think we still need that human element for at least a considerable time going forward. But I think for sure that AI can act as a supplement, essentially like a second reviewer. I think we're close to that, and certainly I could see it being beneficial for reviews like this where we're under extreme time pressure.
Great, thank you. I know we're at time, so I just have one final question. What should we be looking out for between now and 2025? How can we keep pace with everything that's going on? Ansgar or James, do you have comments? I know there was the GBA information session today with some of our colleagues had joined in from Germany. But Ansgar, I know you joined that as well for a part. So I'm curious, how do we not lose track of what's going on?
maybe to start, I think we also have to make a plea to the European Commission and the coordination group to find a way to inform simultaneously a large group of stakeholders. I think the biggest challenge is still to understand this is not about releasing something at the beginning of 2025. Companies, when you look at the timelines that Open Health has presented here today, we are in the middle of preparing for these first submissions. And so I think the more we can now in a broad dissemination of decisions and adoption of methods decisions that have been taken, I think the better. And we will work on this to ensure there is this communication flow.
Mm-hmm. Are there specific milestones we should watch out for when information will be made available, decisions will be taken, or?
I think it's the implementing act and the consultations around those. That's certainly where there is a flow of information. There are events like ISPOR, certainly. I think that many of us go to see there. But then it's not fully clear how ultimately the coordination group, with the Secretariat being the Commission, will release their conclusions for various methods and procedural rules that they have to define.
Helpful.
There are websites. So there are websites of the European Commission, also of the Comitology Committee that's working on the implementing acts. The Commission has a website. The Commission has a rolling plan. I think these are things to watch out for.
Thanks, Ansgar. Anything to add, James?
Yeah, just to build on that, I think it's just critical that we know that this applies to patients and will impact patients from 2025. And so we've got a unique opportunity within Europe over the next 13 months to get this process right. We've had 15 years, I think, of UNETA. We've got great best practice amongst HTA bodies, not just in Europe, but around the world. It's around selecting the best practice of that and not the lowest common denominator to make sure actually Europe has a world-class HTA system that's going to provide predictability and transparency and efficiency, but ultimately quicker access for patients. And we shouldn't be waiting for the first 3 years of it to iron out those difficulties where we can do that now. But that's the only build on that. And the earlier we get that insight, the better we can be prepared, and the better and higher quality those submissions will be to the benefit of patients.
Excellent conclusion that was, James. Thank you. I want to thank the panelists. We had a lot of great interaction, not enough time maybe. We hope these insights have added to your understanding of EU HTA. For those of you who joined, do feel free to reach us offline directly, either me or the panelists. Thank you. And I want to say happy weekend before I close, but I'll hand it over to Sydney.
Yes, thank you all again for your insights today. It was a pleasure having you with us. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this HealthEconomics.com webinar sponsored by Open Health, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.